Hi, my name is Victoria. My pronouns are it, she, and I did my manifesto on decolonizing the trans internet. I feel like the internet, by definition, is a transnational resource since people across the entire world use it. And it's one of the major ways we connect with people across the entire world. The internet is a space for transgender, transsexual, and transvestite individuals. The internet is a radical tool which can be used to communicate on a transnational level. It can allow people who normally wouldn't have spaces to have them. For example, like a trans person who lived in an extremely rural area wouldn't normally have access to trans spaces just because there's not a lot of people around, or someone who lives in a very homophobic place wouldn't have access to a community just because of the external forces. It allows for documentations of transnational issues. And allows for distribution of resources like I know that one of the big things on the internet is like a lot of websites dedicated to offering like resources on transitioning, like how you should have your levels, how you should get your surgeries, all the fun little details, you know? Transness is mostly seen in a white and Western way on the web. White voices are usually centered in trans spaces. The definition of transness is usually perceived in a Western light, something that we don't realize a lot. That the concept of like transgender is very Western. It didn't always exist, even in the West. Before then, it was usually transsexuals and transvestites, and outside of the U.S., people typically don't even really use the word transgender. But transgender is a very Western concept, and we need to understand that when we look at other individuals who are trans, that our definitions of transgender will not fit them. And that's completely fine. It's in fact a very beautiful, beautiful thing. Trans misogyny afflicted people who exist outside of Western definitions are often dismissed and not looked at as trans. Lack of understanding most ideas around transness. Lack of understanding that most ideas around transness are modern and Western. Those are some major problems I always see on the internet. Here's an example of everything wrong with the internet is Susan's Place, a website that a lot of us grew up with. It's horrifically toxic. Anything you can think of wrong in a trans online space exists in Susan's Place. So Susan's Place is an example of a colonizer's trans space. Susan's Place is built around, it's built for post-op, white, wealthy, older trans women. The founder fits all of these categories. Treats white users as perfect and innocent, while also referring to them in very misogynic ways by coddling them. They do cater towards like wide audiences, but even though it is ran by women, there's like a lot of misogyny in how they treat other women. They treat them as like innocent and naive, but they also like push them forward because of their whiteness. It does offer valuable resources for trans femmes. There's not as much for trans men on there, but they do exist. I think I saw literally like 2 articles about trans men in the entire website. It's mainly made for Western audiences. Most things on there are in English. Everything on there is really in English. There's a push on the website to medically define transness. There's an entire like category on the website dedicated to science around transness, and trying to define transness is very foolish, especially around like science, because there's so many definitions for the concept of transness that using like a medical definition will never ever work for it. Historical effects of the early internet. I received most of this information from an oral history of the early trans internet. I reference it at the end of the thing. It's a very, very interesting read. You can learn a lot from it. The early internet in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was only really accessible to rich white people and people capable of homebrewing computers, which usually requires some form of college education. But, I mean, people are capable of amazing feats. Majority of the early internet were in the U.S. and the U.K. and often focused on local activism, but later on this wasn't as common. I think I actually read recently that 75% of modern like internet users come from the global south, and I think 45% are women. Centering of post-op white transsexuals. Centering of post-op white transsexual people. Events were held exclusively for post-op women, notably ones held by the crossdresser Irie Kane. There's a lot of interesting things around that. Irie Kane had a horrible habit of centering themselves and often would mistreat trans women. Transvestite and transgender people often exist in the same spaces, but there was a lack of understanding of mutual struggles, which led to a lot of issues. There wasn't as big of a push to understand each other or learn and unlearn from each other. The trans women would like kink shame the transvestites, and the transvestites would usually hold like a lot of misogynistic views towards the women. Words like transsexual and transvestite were banned on AOL and other large media platforms, so the only exposure people had to transness was commercialized Western porn, which used queer bodies to attract a non-queer audience. And there's a lot of issues that come with that, especially with how like trans people would socialize with one another because their only exposure to transness was through pornography, and that's where a lot of the issues with the transvestites and transgender people originate from, is from that exposure that comes from commercialized pornography, Western pornography. And when I say this, I do not believe there's anything wrong with pornography whatsoever. It's just Western pornography is extremely misogynistic and transphobic. There's a large push to go ahead with your life and blend in, which only makes sense in extremely transphobic places like the US. There's a lot of cultures that have like a place for trans people, and a lot of cultures genuinely celebrate trans people. So a lot of these views don't make sense in those contexts. And there's, just to reiterate, all the info from this comes from an oral history of the early trans internet, which I definitely think everyone should read because I loved it. It's a cute little article. It's a really good read. I'm a big fan. Trans misogyny noir. Black trans women are often, oopsie doodle, there should be an F there, often villainized in queer spaces. I should say in. Oh, shit. Often villainized in queer spaces. Black trans people often be attacked for being critical of white trans people in any way. I even saw this recently on Twitter. They literally made like a cute little joke about like white trans people, and there was all this black backlash from it. And it was just insane. It was all over my feed. These dichotomies will often be worse if the trans person is trans misogyny exempt. Because not only will it be affected by racism, but also misogyny and transphobia. White queers refuse to self-reflect and ask why do they feel this way. The utility of the internet isn't being used fully due to this racism. White queer people will like refuse to engage with black trans women after this. They'll block them, they'll ignore them, whatever they can on the website. and it creates these barriers that are caused by racism, and no one is self-reflecting, so like no one is unpacking those feelings they have towards them. So it creates a lot of issues, and it gets in the way of this idea of creating like the internet is a global resource to communicate with people all across the globe. Web-based monopolies. Capitalism has corrupted the internet, as it does with everything. Facebook will often go to go around the world and offer access to the internet to people who normally wouldn't have access to it, but will only offer access to their own websites. And there's a lot of issues with that, because Facebook is genuinely like a very toxic place where you can go and get turned into a reactionary. And that happens on a global level now. Like, that's not just something that exists in the US, it happens on a global level. Majority of trans discussion happens on social media apps, but offers no resources and is built around acquiring the most clicks. Even though, like, it wasn't normally allowed to talk about transness, it's now being put on these large social media apps that only really started allowing it like 20 years ago or so. And on these websites, it's going to be very filtered out what they can talk about. Like, it would be very difficult to go on Facebook and talk about like kink liberation or something. There's not a lot of trans focused social media, and most trans websites are like Susan's Place, where they're controlled by rich white trans people. And the websites themselves are often very, very old. A lot of them come from the 90s and early aughts. And it's just the resources on there are very dated and don't really fit our current climate. And there's a lot of issues that come from that. And here are my possible solutions. The end goal of my manifesto. Communal, community controlled and owned websites that are owned by the community, owned by the people who use them, and ran by the people who use them, rather than it being controlled by some CEO that doesn't care if you live or die. Unlearning must be a resource that is offered on trans websites. I genuinely believe that so many of the issues that exist within trans spaces could be solved by self-reflection and understanding that transness does not liberate you of whiteness or anything like that. I mean, a rich white trans person is still rich and white. Refuse to define what trans is. Being transgender, transsexual, or a transvestite is an undefinable thing. There is no concrete definition of transness, and that is a very beautiful thing. I would not want to live in a world where that exists. Make spaces for all languages and constantly seek out new people and ideas to prevent a Western echo chamber. One of the things I figured out recently is like it's very easy to like translate anything you find in a foreign language nowadays. So like creating spaces for those other languages would be something that's very easy to do nowadays. Like even non-romantic languages, it's a lot easier to translate it nowadays. There's so many resources around it, and that's a very beautiful thing. Allow spaces for global community building and global care webs. I think it's very important. That's one of the main goals of my manifesto, is creating those global care webs and global community building. Because, there's a lot of people that straight up just need that. If you live in a rural area, I grew up in a rural area, you won't have access to trans people like around you in your neighborhood, but through the internet, you can have access to that. which is why we need to unlearn these things, because we need to make spaces for anyone who lives in an area like that. And people like that don't exclusively live in the US. And we need to make space for that. And that's the end of my presentation, and that's my cute little reference to the an oral history of the early trans internet, which I recommend you read. That's the link right there, gizmondo.com/ all of that. I definitely recommend anyone read it. It's a really good read. Out of all the things I've read, it's my favorite.